What do we know now? I mean, so now, here we are 4 years into the pandemic 4 years later. Um, Lockdowns were so what do you think was worse, lockdowns or vaccine mandates?
Uh, I think of all the bad thing that was done, the one thing that was the worst, I think, if I could change only one thing, are the school closures, which is part of the lockdowns. If I could only change one thing, I would do that. I think that's because that has profound influence on our children. Both the test results has gone down, which when you do the same comparison in Sweden, they did not go down in Sweden because they kept schools open. And that's not a surprise because it's the reason we send kids to school because they learn things. So
Right.
if you then don't send them, you shouldn't be surprised that they're not learning as much. But it's also the other aspect is the social interactions. Children need to interact with other children their age. And I think so that's damaging to not have that social, that builds their social skills.
Yeah.
So I think that's very bad. And so we're going to live with this for a long time. And if there's one thing that we should do now, I think, is to try to make it up to these kids, and really focus on helping these children. Um, but that's not quite happening. But that's what we should do.
Yeah, there isn't I think because people they don't wanna admit they were wrong, and so many people push these school closures, that they're not now saying, "Oh, crap, we need to make up for all the lost education and the lost social skills," and, I mean, especially kids being masked, so they're not able to, like, read each other's facial expressions
Yeah.
or even adults' facial expressions to kind of learn social behavior, and the loss so you're right, the loss of not only just academic education, but also social education, has been lost, and we're not doing really anything to make it up. In fact, some people keep talking about continuing to keep their kids at home or school closures, or now there's a giant push for homeschooling, and a lot of people think that that's, "Oh, this is so great. Homeschooling is being revived and more kids are going to homeschool," but I don't know. I mean, homeschooling is isolating for kids. I mean, then parents say, "Well, no, they get social interaction, but they don't get nearly as much." I mean, there's no way sitting in a classroom with your peers is not the same as sitting at home with mom and then once or twice a week going off to some extracurricular activity. I mean, it's just not the same. Not that I mean, look, homeschooling is good for I'm sure some people, but now there's a big push, so it's almost created um I mean, I just wonder if it's gonna get worse than it is gonna get better, especially when you can't control the quality of homeschooling education from one house to the next.
Well, I think I mean the kids who are homeschooled, they also suffer during the lockdowns because, as you said, they do participate in extracurricular activities with playing soccer or
Right.
little league or going to dance classes or whatever. And they also usually have gatherings where kids from different families they go together and do some educational stuff with other homeschool kids. So that sort of disappear a lot of that. So uh, they uh, they also suffer during the lockdowns, the homeschool kids. So I think all kids suffered.
Yeah. Yeah, and we're not doing anything to make up for it, and kids are still I mean, I don't how would they make up for it? Do you have any ideas of how they would even begin to do that?
Uh,
No summers off. They tell that to the kids. No breaks.
no, they need the summers off also.
Uh,
Uh, and it's not about throwing money into the just more money into the schools, but I think one thing would be to spend less money on the school administrators and spend more money on actually the teachers and including special education teachers who can spend one-on-one on them to with reading skills or with math skills, depending on what kids it is, or with English as a second language skills. So maybe take some of the school administrators who are in a sense responsible for some of this. I know they just follow the CDC guidelines, but and spend more money on teachers who can sort of help those kids who are furthest behind in a
hmm,
one-on-one or like a small group setting.
yeah. Yeah. So going back to Harvard with what's happened to you, where what has been the response? So they were able to let you go. So you were not a tenured professor. I don't know how all that works, but
So at Harvard, it's called an appointment with indefinite duration. So I had that,
okay.
but I lost it anyhow.
And so now what's next for you,
Well, I have to feed my children,
right?
so I do some consulting, and I have colleagues who continue to enjoy working with me. I worked with them for many years, so we do that, and I don't talk too much about it because I don't want to put attention to it, but I do that, and then I'm involved in the Hillsdale has an initiative called the Academy for Science and Freedom, which with me as one of the three founding fellows, together with Dr. Jay Bhattacharya and Dr. Scott Atlas. So our goal is to try and help academia and science to restore its integrity and its search for truth. And I think we have to reform the way that science and academia operates.
So when exactly did you stop working for Harvard?
So I was that was actually a little over 2 years ago, and then I was on technically on leave, and then that ended. They ended that also.
When did they end the leave?
That was a few months ago.
So just a few months ago,
Yeah.
they ended the leave. Even after everything has come out, even after, I mean, so none of them came back to you and said, "Well, it turns out, Dr. Koldorf, you were right." And so we want to keep you around because we need, scientific minds who actually got it right versus keeping everybody who got it wrong.
So last week they actually finally ended their vaccine mandates for students.
Vaccine mandates
So
for students last week. They
that
finally
ended
ended
last
this.
week. So I think
Wow.
that made me happy to hear. So at least that's a tiny bit of thing they did. But no, you're right.
So why have they so they haven't said anything to you? They haven't said to you, "Sorry?"
No, I don't expect that. So
Oh my gosh. It's just shocking that it so have they only kept on people who pretty much kept their mouths shut and went along, or the people who were advocating for these policies?
uh, well, I mean, most people are still working at Harvard, so there's very few people who they let go. So
Well, very few people actually spoke up, I think. As you said, there were a lot of people who maybe agreed with you, but they just were afraid to say anything. They didn't want to get in trouble. They didn't want to sacrifice. And so you ended up being sacrificial, I guess. I mean, it's
I mean, I
just,
know one other professor. She was outspoken, and at some point they were giving her a hard time with something else. So then she decided to leave. So she wasn't fired, but were giving her a hard time. So there are other examples.
have you thought about going back to Sweden? Clearly a lot of people agreed with you there.
So I have to. I have young kids here, so
Uh,
that's my priority. I'm a single father with 50% custody, so
oh, I see.
I will be wherever they are until they are 18, and at that time I can move wherever I want to Mongolia or wherever I fancy at the time.
What has been the reaction in Sweden? I'm sure you talk to people back home. Because I know when Anders Tegnell came out with this policy and was like, "This is what we're doing," and kind of dealt with all the backlash. I think there was a lot of support, but then there seemed to be kind of a turn against him a little bit in Sweden. It seemed like the politicians got antsy and they wanted to start making new policies to kind of rip power away from him a bit, or to give themselves more power so that they could enact things and whatnot. And maybe there was public support for that. Maybe people were afraid because maybe they were reading other Western news and thinking, "Oh gosh, Sweden's getting it wrong and everybody else is getting it right." Now, though, years later, with where they are now, are people in Sweden saying, "Yeah, we got it right," or are they saying, "Well, it was luck"? I mean, what are they thinking
So I think Anders Tegnell had very strong public support. Um,
throughout the whole time?
Throughout the whole time, and I know that was from personal context, but also from surveys. So I don't think that was ever a problem. there was a time when the politicians did get antsy, as you said. I think they felt not so much the pressure from internal population, but from other countries. So
Right.
they did institute some measures that went beyond what Tegnell wanted. I think it didn't last for that long, but they did that, and I don't think it helps Sweden anything to do it. But I think the politicians, to some extent, felt some pressure from other countries.
Mm.
I would say there was a very healthy debate actually in Sweden because there was a small group of scientists, only one epidemiologist, but then there were other scientists who they were called the Group of 22. They were publishing a number of op-eds criticizing Tegnell and the Swedish approach. So I also, in the spring of 2020, published. I had no problems. I couldn't publish in the US at the time, but I had no problems publishing in the major Swedish daily newspapers, basically trying to support the Swedish approach against this criticism. So there was a very healthy debate, and I'm very glad that they were able to publish their criticism because it's important to have that debate, and then Tegnell and others can sort of respond and say, no, 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 this is the reason why the approach is the good one. So they never got much public support, uh, but it was good that they spoke out, and major daily newspapers published articles by both those who criticized Tegnell and those who supported Tegnell. And I think that's very good. That's how journalism should work. So I think that was very good. So Sweden, I think, did very well to keep that debate open, while here it was basically timid.
Right. Anybody who criticized was smeared, like you were. It's interesting, though, that in Sweden it was like the reverse. It was a small group of scientists who were against what Anders Tegnell was doing, which was the opposite of what the rest of the world was doing. And it was
Yeah.
like a smaller group that was like, no, we should lock down. We should do what everybody else is doing. It's
And
like
I
a
think there
backwards
was
world.
people who it was there were not there was only I think one epidemiologist, but the other who dealt with like vector-borne diseases. But so the other ones were other type of scientists. There was like a mathematician, there was an oncologist, and so on. But most were not even in medicine. But I think a lot of them read what other countries were doing, and they sort of felt that Sweden should do the same. They were sort of convinced by the consensus that existed in other countries.
Well, yeah,
It
to
was very
follow
much
the crowd.
influenced by the US and the UK and Germany and so on.
Yeah. So interesting. I mean, it's just like an alternative universe going on over there in Sweden. That's why it was so fascinating, and it's amazing now that years later it turns out that they were right. They were that they didn't suffer. In fact, they did better because of the kids. Have you been
Yeah, that was
following
interesting for me also personally because I was supporting the Swedish approach, which was the Social Democrats. So I guess in Sweden I was sort of a socialist, and then in the US I was supporting the DeSantis, who wanted to keep things open. So here I was a right-wing extremist.
right? Here
So
you were a
that was very
libertarian.
strange. And for me, public health is public health, and I care about everybody. I don't care who they voted for. I care about them leading a healthy public life, and so to me, I put aside my politics just to sort of put on my hat as a public health scientist because
Right.
that was the right thing to do. And I had interviews after the Great Barrington Declaration in the fall of 2020. I did interviews with media both on the whole spectrum from the left to the right. And I
Yeah,
think
it's
that's
been
what you have to do as a public health person. You have to
right.
reach as many groups as possible. So you want to sort of reach people in different media who consume different types of media.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, during, the COVID pandemic, I found myself aligning with a lot of people that I don't maybe agree with on a lot of other political points, and now that the pandemic has sort of waned and people have talked about other topics, it's interesting to see, where the divisions are now with people that maybe agreed on COVID, but that's okay. I mean, to me, I think it's fine for us to disagree on all kinds of political points and issues, but yeah, public health should be public health, care and most importantly, the debates should happen on all topics. We should be able to debate rather than silencing and smearing and calling somebody a conspiracy theorist.